The old recording device clicked on with a soft hum. Crindle stared at its red light for a long moment before speaking. His scaled hands shook slightly as he adjusted his position in the metal chair. The human across from him waited patiently, stylus ready over a data pad. "You want to know about the war?" Crindle said finally. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "About what humans did during the Great Convergence War. Everyone thinks they know the story. They think humans won because they were lucky, or because the hegemony made mistakes. But they are wrong." Dr. Helen Nash, the human historian, leaned forward slightly. She had interviewed hundreds of war survivors over the past 5 years, but none had spoken with such intensity right from the start. "Please tell me what you saw." Crindle's large eyes, adapted for low light conditions on his homeworld, seemed to look through the walls of the research station. "I was there as an observer. My people, the Vorthak, we have a gift. Our brain chemistry makes us neutral in all conflicts. We cannot choose sides even if we want to. This made us perfect war correspondents. We could document battles without bias, report on tactics without favoring anyone." He paused, touching a scar that ran along his neck. "The Galactic Council assigned me to study military innovations during the war. I was to observe all sides and report which methods worked best. The hegemony welcomed me because they were proud of their advanced warfare techniques. 12 different species, all masters of combat, all certain they would crush the primitive humans within months." Dr. Nash made notes quickly. The Vorthak were legendary for their neutrality. Their testimony was considered the most reliable in the galaxy. "How long were you embedded with various forces?"
3 years.
"I started with the hegemony fleets. Magnificent ships, weapons that could crack planets, soldiers trained from birth for war. Everything was efficient, calculated, perfect. They showed me battle plans that accounted for every variable. They had studied human technology and found it laughably simple. Kinetic weapons when they had plasma, chemical rockets when they had gravity drives, metal armor when they had energy shields." Crindle's expression grew troubled. "The hegemony commanders were so confident. Admiral Thoss told me humans would surrender after the first real battle. Commander Vril said it would be like fighting children with sticks. They had graphs showing how human resistance would collapse within 6 months. The data was clear. The logic was perfect, but," Dr. Nash prompted. "But the first battle lasted 3 days longer than predicted. The second battle, humans used tactics that made no sense. They protected civilian evacuation routes instead of strategic positions. They rescued wounded hegemony soldiers instead of taking prisoners. The commanders were confused but not worried. They said humans simply did not understand proper warfare yet." Crindle stood up and walked to the small window. Outside, stars glittered in the darkness of space. "I requested transfer to human forces after 6 months. I told my superiors I needed to study both sides to write a complete report. Really, I was curious. How could such primitive beings last so long against the greatest military alliance in galactic history? The hegemony approved the transfer?" They laughed when I asked. "Admiral Thoss said I would be bored watching humans run around like frightened animals. He gave me a security escort and wished me luck studying inferior tactics up close." The Vorthak's scaled skin shifted color slightly, a sign of emotional distress in his species. "The human transport that picked me up was damaged. Hull breaches, broken weapons, half the crew wounded. I expected to find soldiers in despair ready to surrender. Instead, they were joking with each other, sharing food with alien refugees they had rescued. The ship's doctor was treating a captured hegemony pilot with the same care as human wounded." Dr. Nash looked up from her notes. "How did that strike you at the time?" "I thought they were insane. Wasting medical supplies on enemies, sharing rations when they were already short on food, risking their lives for beings who wanted them dead. It went against every principle of warfare I had studied. I documented it all, certain these examples would show why humans were losing the war." Crindle returned to his chair, his large eyes focusing on the historian. "But they were not losing. Every week I stayed with them. I saw battles where humans should have been crushed but somehow survived. Engagements where they turned certain defeat into stalemate, not through superior weapons or brilliant strategy, but through something I could not understand." "Can you give me a specific example?" "The defense of Relay Station 7. Hegemony forces outnumbered humans 5 to 1. They had better ships, better weapons, better tactical position. The human commander, a woman named Colonel Brooks, could have evacuated and preserved her forces. Instead, she stayed to defend the station because it was protecting refugee ships from 3 different species, including some hegemony civilians fleeing the war. Krindal's voice grew quieter. She held that station for 18 hours against impossible odds. When hegemony reinforcements finally arrived to help the refugees, they found human and alien bodies side by side, humans who had died protecting the families of their enemies. The hegemony commander who led the rescue, General Court, stood in the wreckage for an hour without speaking. I documented his expression. I had never seen such confusion on a warrior's face. The pattern repeated everywhere I went. Humans making choices that seemed tactically wrong but somehow worked. They would sacrifice strategic advantages to save lives, give up superior positions to protect civilians, waste ammunition destroying empty buildings instead of occupied ones just to avoid casualties. Dr. Nash stopped writing and looked at the old Vorthak. You sound like these memories still affect you strongly. Krindal nodded slowly. 20 years later, and I still think about what I saw every day. At first I thought humans were simply bad at war. Then I thought they were lucky. Finally, I realized they were not playing the same game as everyone else. While the hegemony fought to win battles, humans fought for something else entirely. What were they fighting for? That is what haunts me, Dr. Nash. That is what keeps me awake at night, even now. Krindal reached over and turned off the recording device. To understand that, you need to hear about Haven Colony, about what happened when humans had to choose between victory and their souls. The research station hummed quietly around them as the old alien prepared to continue his story, the weight of memory heavy in the small room. Rain fell in sheets across the muddy landing pad as Krindal stepped off the transport shuttle. His first impression of forward-operating Base Defiance was one of chaos barely held in check. Human soldiers rushed between hastily constructed buildings. Their equipment, a strange mix of advanced technology and primitive repairs held together with metal tape and hope. A young human soldier approached him, her uniform soaked and dirty. You must be our observer. I'm Sergeant Martinez. Welcome to the garden spot of the Outer Rim. She gestured at the rain-soaked base with a grin that seemed completely inappropriate given their circumstances. Krindal had expected something different. The hegemony bases he had observed were models of efficiency, with every structure built to exact specifications and every soldier moving with practiced precision. This human outpost looked like it had been built by people making up the rules as they went along. Where is your commanding officer? Krindal asked, pulling his weather gear tighter against the rain. Colonel Rivers is in the medical bay. We took some casualties yesterday and he likes to check on everyone personally. Martinez led him through the mud toward a large, prefabricated building. Fair warning, he might be a while. The colonel talks to every wounded soldier, human or otherwise. Otherwise? Martinez nodded toward a section of the medical facility. We've got some hegemony prisoners who were hurt in the fighting. Doc Williams patches them up same as our people. Colonel's orders. This struck Krindal as highly irregular. In hegemony facilities, enemy wounded received basic medical care to keep them alive for questioning. Nothing more. Wasting advanced medical supplies on prisoners was considered poor resource management. Inside the medical bay, the scene was even more confusing. Human medics worked alongside alien doctors who had apparently volunteered their services. Wounded humans lay on beds next to captured hegemony soldiers. A young human nurse was carefully feeding soup to a Cathera warrior whose arms had been injured in battle. Colonel Rivers stood beside one of the beds, talking quietly with a bandaged human soldier. The colonel was not what Krindal had expected either. Most hegemony commanders carried themselves with rigid military bearing and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. Rivers looked tired, his uniform wrinkled, and he spoke to his soldiers like a father checking on his children. The important thing is you get better, the colonel was saying. We can worry about the rest later. When he noticed Krindal, Rivers walked over and extended his hand in the human greeting gesture. You must be our Vorthak observer. I'm David Rivers. Sorry about the informal welcome, but we've been a bit busy. Krindal studied the human commander. Rivers appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, despite the circumstances. I am here to document your military procedures and tactical innovations. Well, you've come to an interesting place for that. Rivers led him to a small office adjacent to the medical bay. The room was cluttered with maps, reports, and what appeared to be children's drawings taped to one wall. Those are from the refugee camp we're protecting.
Kids from 6 different species, all drawing pictures of our soldiers.
Makes you remember what we're really fighting for. This casual mixing of personal sentiment with military duty puzzled Crindal. Your tactical situation here appears complicated. Rivers poured coffee from a metal pot and offered a cup to his guest. That's one way to put it. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and holding a position that's tactically questionable at best. But there are 40,000 civilians in that refugee camp, and they're counting on us to keep them safe. Would it not be more militarily sound to evacuate to a more defensible position? Probably. Rivers sipped his coffee and looked out the window toward the refugee camp. But those families have already been driven from their homes once. Some of them are hegemony civilians whose own governments labeled them traitors for not supporting the war. Where exactly would we evacuate them to? Crindal made notes on his portable recorder. So you maintain this position despite tactical disadvantage for humanitarian reasons? I maintain this position because it's the right thing to do. Rivers turned back to him with a serious expression. Look, I know how this must appear to you. The hegemony probably told you we're primitive, that we don't understand proper military doctrine. Maybe they're right about the primitive part. Our weapons are simpler, our ships are slower, and we definitely don't have their tactical training. Then how do you expect to prevail in this conflict? Rivers was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. We don't fight to prevail, Mr. Crindal. We fight to protect. There's a difference. Before Crindal could ask what that meant, alarms began sounding throughout the base. Soldiers rushed past the office window, taking defensive positions. Rivers stood immediately and grabbed his equipment. Hegemony patrol ships, 3 of them, he said after listening to his radio. Looks like they're testing our defenses again. Crindal followed the colonel to the command center, expecting to see preparations for combat. Instead, he found something that defied all military logic. Human soldiers were taking defensive positions, but they were also helping move refugee families to reinforced shelters. Medical personnel were preparing emergency aid stations not just for human casualties, but for potential hegemony wounded as well, sir. We could hit their lead ship if we use the civilian sector as cover. One officer suggested. They won't fire on their own people. Rivers shook his head firmly. We don't use civilians as shields, Captain. Not their civilians, not ours, not anyone's. Deploy defensive positions that protect the refugee camp without putting anyone in the line of fire. But sir, that gives us a significant tactical disadvantage. Then we'll have to be creative. Dal watched as the human forces arranged themselves in positions that protected everyone in the camp while leaving themselves more vulnerable to attack. When the hegemony ships opened fire, human defensive systems intercepted most of the incoming fire, but several shots got through and damaged human positions. What happened next stunned the Vorthak observer completely. Instead of returning fire immediately, the humans broadcast a message to the hegemony ships identifying the location of refugee families from hegemony species and requesting they direct their fire away from civilian areas. The hegemony ships stopped firing. For almost 10 minutes, the 3 patrol ships held position without attacking. Crindal could see them on the tactical display, apparently debating what to do. Finally, they withdrew without firing another shot. Colonel Rivers turned to his communications officer. Send a medical supply manifest to those ships. If they have wounded aboard, we'll treat them. Sir, you heard me. Standard humanitarian offer under the Galactic Conventions. As the base stood down from alert status, Crindal approached Colonel Rivers with growing confusion. I do not understand your tactics. You could have destroyed at least one of those ships if you had used standard military doctrine. Rivers looked at him with genuine surprise. And killed how many beings in the process? Those ships had crews of 60 each. That's 180 lives. For what, to prove we could kill them? To win the engagement. Mr. Crindal, if I have to kill 180 people to win a fight, then I've already lost everything that matters. That night, as Crindal reviewed his recordings in his assigned quarters, he found himself more confused than when he had arrived. Nothing the humans did made sense according to established military theory. They consistently chose options that preserved life over options that secured tactical advantage. They treated enemies with the same care as allies. They risked themselves to protect people who wanted them dead. By every measure he had been trained to use, the humans at Forward Operating Base Defiance were terrible soldiers. So why were they still alive? The emergency broadcast reached every ship and station in the sector simultaneously. Krindal was reviewing his notes aboard the human medical vessel Mercy when the message cut through all other communications with cold military precision. Attention all forces in the Haven system. This is Fleet Commander Zeph of the Hegemony 3rd Battle Group. Haven Colony is now under siege. All human military assets have 48 hours to withdraw from the system, or the colony will be reduced to ash. This is not a negotiation. Around him, the crew of the Mercy fell silent. Krindal looked up from his work to see human faces displaying a mixture of determination and sorrow. Dr. Sarah Kim, the ship's chief medical officer, closed her eyes and took a deep breath before activating the ship's communications. All medical staff to stations. Prep emergency trauma bays for mass casualties. This is not a drill. Haven Colony was home to 2.3 million beings from 14 different species. It had started as a mining operation but grew into something unprecedented in galactic history. A truly mixed community where different species lived and worked together as equals. The colony included humans but also refugees from the hegemony itself, people who had fled their own governments rather than support the war. Krindal had been documenting the medical ship's operations for 3 weeks, studying how humans treated wounded from all sides of the conflict. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about military medicine. Human medics didn't just treat injuries. They provided psychological counseling, helped families contact loved ones, and even organized recreational activities for long-term patients. "Dr. Kim," he called out as she passed, "surely the humans will withdraw rather than face the entire 3rd Battle Group." She stopped and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Krindal, there are children down there. Human children, yes, but also Cathera children, Zentari children, even some young hegemony citizens whose parents defected. Are you asking me if we're going to abandon them? I am asking if you will sacrifice your military forces in a battle you cannot win." "Watch and learn," she said softly, then moved to her station. Within 6 hours, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of withdrawing, human ships from across 3 sectors started jumping into the Haven system, not to evacuate but to reinforce. Destroyers that should have been protecting supply lines, medical vessels that should have been treating wounded far from the front lines, even damaged ships that should have been in repair yards. The human response made no military sense. Haven Colony had minimal strategic value, and its loss would not significantly impact the overall war effort. Any rational military command would write off the colony and preserve their forces for more important battles. But as Krindal watched ship after ship arrive, he realized the humans were not making a rational military decision. They were making a moral one. Admiral Chen, the human commander who took charge of the growing fleet, addressed all personnel in a system-wide broadcast. "I know what the tactical computers are telling you. I know the odds we're facing. But those numbers down there aren't statistics. They're families. They're people who trusted us to protect them, and we're not going to let them down." The hegemony response was swift and overwhelming. Fleet Commander Zeph brought in reinforcements until his battle group numbered over 300 ships. The humans had managed to gather barely 60 vessels, most of them damaged or outdated. The outcome seemed certain. Krindal found himself assigned to document the siege from the planet's surface, embedded with the human ground forces preparing Haven Colony's defense. What he saw there defied all logic even more than the fleet situation above. While human soldiers prepared defensive positions, they were also working frantically to expand refugee shelters, set up additional medical stations, and organize food distribution for the colony's population. Half their effort went to military preparations. The other half went to civilian care. Major Williams, the ground commander, noticed Krindal's confusion during a briefing. "Something bothering you, observer? Your resource allocation appears inefficient. You are using military personnel for humanitarian tasks that could be handled by civilians." Williams smiled grimly. "Those humanitarian tasks are why we're here. The military stuff is just what we have to do to protect them. But if you focused entirely on military preparation, you would have a better chance of successful defense." "Successful defense of what? Empty buildings? The colony isn't the structures, Krindal. It's the people. If we save the buildings but lose the people, we've failed completely." The siege began exactly 48 hours after the ultimatum. Krindle expected massive orbital bombardment followed by ground assault, the standard hegemony approach to overwhelming enemy positions. Instead, the attack began with surgical strikes against military targets, carefully avoiding civilian areas. The humans responded not with counter-bombardment, but with a galaxy-wide broadcast. Admiral Chen appeared on every communication channel, speaking directly to the hegemony forces. This is Admiral Chen of the Human Defense Force. Before you continue this attack, we want you to know who you're bombing. Haven Colony is home to over 40,000 hegemony citizens, including families of soldiers currently serving in your fleet. We're uploading a complete civilian registry so you can see if any of your own people are here. The broadcast included names, faces, and family connections. Krindle watched hegemony soldiers recognize relatives among the colony's population. The tactical bombardment stopped for over an hour, while hegemony commanders presumably debated their next move. When the attack resumed, it was noticeably less intensive. Weapons that could have leveled city blocks were used only against specifically military targets. The hegemony forces seemed to be trying to minimize civilian casualties, even while attempting to destroy human defensive positions. Major Williams found Krindle in one of the command bunkers as explosions thundered overhead.
See what's happening out there?
The hegemony appears to be restraining their bombardment to avoid civilian casualties. Right. And why do you think they're doing that? Krindle considered the question carefully. Because they recognize their own people among the population. Exactly. They're not monsters, Krindle. They're soldiers following orders just like us. But when they have to choose between following those orders and protecting innocent people, including their own families, what do you think they choose? The siege continued for 6 more days. Each day the pattern repeated. Hegemony forces would begin intensive bombardment. Humans would broadcast information about civilian casualties and refugee families, and the bombardment would become more restrained. Human ground forces used this restraint not to launch counterattacks, but to evacuate more civilians to safety and provide better medical care for everyone, including wounded hegemony pilots who had been shot down. On the 7th day, something unprecedented happened. A hegemony destroyer broke formation and began providing cover fire for refugee evacuation ships. Captain Torres, the destroyer's commander, broadcast his reasons to both fleets. My daughter is in that refugee camp. I will not fire on my own child to follow orders from people who have never seen this war up close. Within hours, 3 more hegemony ships had joined the humans in protecting Haven Colony. Fleet Commander Zeph's response was immediate and harsh. He ordered the rebel ships destroyed and resumed bombardment of the colony. But now his own forces were fighting each other while trying to attack the humans. Krindle watched this development with growing amazement. The humans had not defeated the hegemony through superior firepower or brilliant tactics. They had simply forced the enemy to confront the moral cost of their orders. And when faced with that choice, increasing numbers of hegemony soldiers chose to protect life rather than follow commands. The siege ended not with human victory, but with hegemony collapse. Fleet Commander Zeph found himself commanding barely half his original force, with the rest either joining the humans or withdrawing from the system entirely. As evacuation ships carried civilians to safety and human medical teams treated wounded from all sides, Major Williams approached Krindle one final time. Still think our tactics are inefficient? Krindle looked around at human soldiers sharing their rations with former enemies, at hegemony defectors working alongside the people they had been trying to kill days earlier, at children from a dozen species playing together in the evacuation camps. I think, he said slowly, I do not understand what efficiency means anymore. Dawn came slowly to Haven Colony on the day that would change everything. Krindle stood in the observation tower of the Human Command Center, watching as morning light revealed the devastating aftermath of 12 days of siege. Smoke rose from dozens of impact craters scattered across the colony's outer districts, but the residential areas remained largely intact. Below him, human soldiers moved through their morning routines with the same careful attention to civilian welfare they had shown since the siege began. Medical teams made their rounds through both human and hegemony wounded. Kitchen staff prepared meals for everyone in the colony, regardless of species or allegiance. Children from 14 different worlds played in the reinforced shelters while their parents worked alongside human volunteers to maintain basic services. Commander Brooks found him at his observation post as the first enemy formations appeared on the horizon. "Today's different," she said, her voice carrying an edge of grim determination. "Fleet Commander Zeph has called in reinforcements. Our sources indicate he's planning a final ground assault." Krindal adjusted his recording equipment to capture the approaching battle. "Will you evacuate the civilians?" "Can't. They've got the evacuation routes covered with orbital weapons. Anyone who tries to leave the colony gets vaporized." Brooks checked her rifle and adjusted her equipment. Zeph's decided that if he can't have a clean victory, he'll settle for complete destruction. The human commander paused, looking out at the colony below. "He's forcing us to choose between abandoning everyone here or dying with them. And your choice?" Brooks smiled, the same inappropriate grin that seemed to be standard among human soldiers facing impossible odds. "There's no choice to make. These people trusted us to protect them. That's what we're going to do." The final assault began at noon with the most intensive bombardment the colony had experienced. Orbital weapons designed to crack planetary defenses pounded human positions, while ground forces advanced from 3 directions. Krindal documented it all, his Vorthak training allowing him to remain objective even as explosions shook the command center around him. What he recorded next would haunt him for the rest of his life. As hegemony, ground forces advanced into the colony's outskirts. They encountered human soldiers who could have retreated to better defensive positions but chose instead to fight from locations that protected civilian shelters. Private Johnson died holding a checkpoint that covered a nursery school. Sergeant Martinez lost her life defending a medical station treating wounded hegemony prisoners. Each human death was tactically unnecessary and strategically pointless. Each human death also saved dozens of civilian lives. The advancing hegemony forces began to slow as they realized what they were seeing. These humans weren't just soldiers fighting for territory. They were people dying to protect anyone who needed protection, including families of the soldiers trying to kill them. Captain Voss, leading the hegemony's eastern assault, called a halt to his advance when his troops reached a human defensive position built around a refugee shelter. Inside the shelter were 43 beings from 7 different species, including 12 hegemony children whose parents had defected earlier in the war. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "the human position is lightly defended. We could overwhelm it easily." Voss stared through his binoculars at the human soldiers. There were only 6 of them, clearly exhausted and running low on ammunition. They had positioned themselves to protect the shelter's entrance, making no attempt to find better cover for themselves. "Captain Torres is among the children in that shelter," the communications officer added quietly. Captain Torres.
Voss knew him personally.
A decorated officer whose daughter had been among the first hegemony families to seek refuge in Haven Colony. Torres had been branded a traitor by high command, but Voss remembered him as a good soldier and a devoted father. "Sir, your orders?" Voss watched as one of the human soldiers shared his water ration with a wounded hegemony pilot who had been shot down the previous day. The pilot was clearly an enemy, barely conscious and unable to fight. The human had no tactical reason to help him and every reason to preserve his limited supplies. "Stand down," Voss ordered. "Sir," I said, "stand down. We're not advancing on that position." Similar scenes played out across the battlefield as hegemony forces encountered humans dying to protect hegemony civilians. Commander Vorth found his assault stalled when his troops refused to attack a medical station where human doctors were treating wounded hegemony soldiers. Colonel Zane's mechanized unit stopped, advancing after they realized the humans they were fighting had been sharing their food supplies with hegemony prisoners for the entire siege. Breaking point came when young Lieutenant Court, leading a platoon in the northern assault, reached a human position defending a group of mixed families. Among the civilians was his own sister, who had married a human engineer and stayed in the colony when the war began. Court had been ordered to eliminate all human resistance in his sector. Following those orders meant killing the humans who had been protecting his sister and her infant son for 2 weeks. He lowered his weapon. "Lieutenant," his sergeant questioned. "Sir, we have clear shots on the human positions." Court looked at the human soldiers. They had seen his forces and were preparing to fight, but they weren't retreating. Even facing overwhelming odds, they remained positioned to protect the civilians behind them. "Sergeant, do you have family?" "Yes, sir. Wife and 2 children back on Cathera Prime. Would you want someone to protect them if they were in danger?" The sergeant followed his lieutenant's gaze to the mixed group of families huddled behind the human defensive line. Sir, Yes, sir.
I would. Then how can we fire on people who are protecting families just like ours?
The word spread through the hegemony assault forces like a virus. Unit after unit began questioning their orders as they encountered humans who consistently chose to protect life over preserving their own survival. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for warfare found themselves unable to fire on people who were dying to save others. Fleet Commander Zeph's response from orbit was swift and brutal. When his ground forces stopped advancing, he ordered orbital bombardment of their positions along with the human defenders. His own soldiers, he declared, were traitors if they would not eliminate the human threat. The bombardment that followed killed hegemony and human soldiers alike, along with some of the civilians both sides had been trying to protect. Crindal recorded it all from his observation post, watching in horror as Zeph chose to destroy his own people rather than accept their refusal to kill civilians. But the bombardment had an effect Zeph never intended. Hegemony soldiers across the battlefield watched their own fleet killing them for refusing to murder families. The moral weight of the choice became impossible to ignore. By sunset, over half of the hegemony ground forces had laid down their weapons, not in surrender to the humans, but in refusal to continue serving commanders who would kill their own troops for showing mercy. Commander Brooks found Crindal as the strange ceasefire settled over the colony. Are you getting all this recorded? Yes, though I am not sure anyone will believe it. What part? Crindal gestured at the scene below them. Human and hegemony soldiers were working together to dig survivors out of the areas hit by the orbital bombardment. Former enemies shared medical supplies and helped each other treat wounded from both sides. All of it. Your people have done something I have never seen in 40 years of documenting warfare. You have made your enemies choose between their orders and their consciences. Brooks sat down heavily on a piece of rubble, exhaustion finally showing in her posture. We didn't make them choose anything. We just showed them what the choice really was, which was whether they wanted to be the kind of people who kill families or the kind who protect them. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. Turns out most beings, when you strip away all the politics and propaganda and military doctrine, would rather be protectors than killers. As night fell over Haven Colony, Crindal reviewed his recordings of the day's events. What he had documented was not a military victory or defeat. It was something far more profound. The moment when warfare itself began to break down in the face of simple human decency. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as both sides tried to figure out what to do with an army that refused to fight and a war that no longer made sense to the people ordered to fight it. But tonight, children from a dozen worlds slept safely because humans had chosen their lives over military victory. 3 months after Haven Colony, Crindal found himself aboard a hegemony transport vessel that had been converted into a mobile refugee center. The irony was not lost on him. Former military ships now carried supplies and medical aid instead of weapons, crewed by soldiers from both sides working together to help war survivors. Captain Silva, the human officer coordinating refugee operations, handed him a datapad containing casualty reports from across the galaxy. Take a look at these numbers, Crindal. Tell me what you see. The Vorthak observer studied the reports with growing amazement. Military engagement statistics from the past 3 months showed something unprecedented in galactic military history. Hegemony forces were surrendering at rates that made no tactical sense. Entire fleets were laying down arms without firing a shot. Ground campaigns were being abandoned mid-operation when soldiers simply refused to continue fighting. The hegemony war effort appears to be collapsing, Crindal noted, but not due to military defeats. Right, want to know what's really happening out there? Over the following weeks, Crindal traveled to 7 different star systems, documenting a phenomenon that defied every principle of warfare he had ever studied. The pattern was the same everywhere. Hegemony forces would engage human units, encounter the same moral choices that had paralyzed their comrades at Haven Colony, and find themselves unable to continue fighting people who died to protect others. On Kepler 438b, he interviewed Commander Wrath, a Kythera officer who had surrendered his entire battle group after watching human medics treat wounded Kythera soldiers during an active firefight. They could have left our wounded to die, Wrath told him. Standard military doctrine would have required it. Instead, they risked their own lives to save my people while my people were trying to kill them. The commander's scarred face showed the weight of his decision. How do you continue fighting someone who would die to save your wounded? How do you look at your own troops and order them to kill people like that? On the mining world of Titan 7, Grindal documented the surrender of an entire hegemony garrison after they discovered that human forces had been secretly delivering medical supplies to hegemony families in occupied territories. The humans had used their knowledge of hegemony supply routes not for military advantage, but to ensure that civilian populations had adequate food and medicine. Colonel Vex, the garrison commander, showed Grindal the supply drops. Food, medical supplies, even educational materials for the children, all delivered by people we were ordered to consider monsters. His voice carried a note of bewilderment. We were told humans would rape our worlds and enslave our people. Instead, they were keeping our children healthy. The most dramatic case came from the Zentari home system, where Admiral Chorus had been leading the defense of the species' capital world. Hegemony High Command had declared the system a fortress that would fight to the last ship. Instead, Chorus negotiated a ceasefire after human forces offered to help evacuate civilian populations from combat zones. The humans could have bombarded our cities, Chorus explained during Grindal's interview. Their fleet had us outgunned and surrounded. Instead, they offered safe passage to any Zentari civilians who wanted to leave the combat areas. They provided escort ships and medical support for the evacuation. The Admiral's normally stoic expression cracked slightly. My youngest daughter was among the evacuees. Human soldiers died protecting the transport ship she was on, died protecting the child of their enemy because she was just a little girl who shouldn't be in a war zone. But the most revealing interview came from Dr. Senth, a hegemony military psychologist who had been studying the mass surrenders. It's not battle fatigue, she told Grindal. It's not fear of death or concern about losing the war. It's something completely different. What do you mean? My soldiers are having moral crises. They joined the military to protect their people and serve their governments. But when they see humans dying to protect hegemony civilians, they start asking fundamental questions about who the real protectors are. Dr. Senth showed him psychological evaluation reports from hundreds of surrendered soldiers. They describe the same experience over and over. They see humans make choices that their own training would never allow. Humans sacrifice tactical advantages to save lives. They risk themselves to protect enemy civilians. They share resources with prisoners. They treat wounded enemies with the same care as their own people. And this causes psychological distress. It causes them to question everything they thought they knew about the war. If humans are the enemy, why are they behaving more honorably than we are? If we're the good guys, why don't we make the same choices they do? The doctor leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Some of my patients have started asking if they're fighting on the wrong side. As Grindal compiled his research, the scope of what was happening became clear. The human strategy, if it could even be called a strategy, was unlike anything in military history. They were not defeating enemy forces through superior firepower or brilliant tactics. They were converting them by consistently demonstrating a moral standard that enemy soldiers found impossible to fight against. Captain Silva found him in his temporary quarters, aboard the refugee ship as he worked on his analysis. Figure it out yet? I believe so. Humans are not winning this war through conventional military means. You are winning by forcing your enemies to choose between following orders and maintaining their moral integrity. And when forced to make that choice, most beings choose to preserve their sense of right and wrong, rather than follow commands that violate their conscience. Silva nodded thoughtfully. That's part of it. But there's something else, something deeper. What do you mean? We're not trying to force anyone to choose anything. We're just being ourselves. Everything you've documented, all these moral choices that seem so strategic to you, we don't make them to win the war. We make them because they're the right thing to do. Grindal looked up from his notes. You mean this is simply how humans behave naturally? When we're at our best, yeah. The thing is, most species assume that war changes the rules, that combat suspends normal moral behavior, but humans at our best don't see it that way. War doesn't change who we are. It reveals who we are. Silva walked to the small porthole and looked out at the stars. The hegemony expected us to become monsters when they attacked us. Instead, we became more ourselves. We protected people because that's what we do. We helped the wounded because that's who we are. We shared our resources because that's how we think civilized beings should behave. And this natural behavior is what causes enemy forces to surrender? This natural behavior forces them to confront what they've become. When a soldier sees a human die to save a hegemony child, that soldier has to ask himself, what am I doing here? What have I become? Is this really what I want to be? Crindle spent the rest of the night reviewing his recordings and interviews, seeing them in a new light. The humans had not developed a new form of warfare. They had simply refused to let warfare change their fundamental nature. In doing so, they had created a moral mirror that reflected back to their enemies exactly what the war had made them become. And most beings, when shown that reflection clearly enough, found they could not live with what they saw. The war was ending not through conquest but through conversion. The hegemony was collapsing not from military defeat but from moral awakening. Across the galaxy, soldiers were laying down their weapons not in surrender, but in recognition that they no longer wanted to be the kind of people who killed those who died to save others. As dawn light filtered through the porthole, Crindle realized he was documenting something unprecedented. The first war in galactic history ended by the power of consistent human decency. The recording device clicked off with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for the weight of everything that had been said. Dr. Nash set down her stylus and looked across the table at Crindle, whose scaled hands had not stopped trembling throughout the final hour of his testimony. That's quite a story, she said gently. The war ending through moral conversion rather than military victory. I can see why the historical record needed this perspective. Crindle stared at the silent recording device for a long moment before speaking. You think that is what haunts me? The memory of war? The violence? The deaths? Dr. Nash frowned slightly. Isn't it? You've described some traumatic experiences. Witnessing combat, seeing good people die, watching the collapse of military order. No. Crindle's voice was barely above a whisper. That is not what keeps me awake at night. That is not why I agreed to give this testimony after 20 years of silence. He stood up slowly and walked to the small window overlooking the research station's garden area. Outside, beings from dozens of species worked together tending plants, their children playing nearby in the afternoon light. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, and somehow profound in its simple demonstration of cooperation. Dr. Nash, what do you know about Vorthak biology? The basics. Your species is famous for neural neutrality. You're physically incapable of taking sides in conflicts. It made you ideal as war correspondents and peace negotiators. Exactly. For 3 million years of evolution, my people have been observers. We watch, we record, we analyze, but we never choose sides. We cannot choose sides. Our brain chemistry prevents us from developing the kind of emotional attachments that would compromise our objectivity. Crindle touched his temple with one scaled finger. This neutrality is not just our profession. It is our identity. It is what makes us Vorthak. We are the watchers, the recorders, the neutral parties who can see truth because we have no stake in the outcome. Dr. Nash waited, sensing there was more to come. But something happened to me during those 3 years documenting the human war effort, something that should have been impossible. He turned back to face her, his large eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than memory. I started to care. The words hung in the air between them like a confession of the deepest kind. At first I told myself it was professional interest. The humans were behaving in ways that challenged military doctrine, so of course I was fascinated. Then I convinced myself it was scientific curiosity. Their moral choices were creating unprecedented battlefield outcomes, worthy of detailed study. Crindle returned to his chair but did not sit. Instead he stood behind it, gripping the back with both hands. But I was lying to myself. The truth is, watching humans die to save others began to affect me emotionally. Seeing them share resources with enemies started to feel important to me personally. Documenting their refusal to abandon civilians became more than professional duty. That must have been confusing. Confusing. Crindle's laugh was bitter. Dr. Nash, you do not understand. For a Vorthak to develop emotional investment in one side of a conflict is like a human suddenly growing wings. It should not be possible. It violates the fundamental nature of what we are. He began pacing the small room, his agitation growing. I told myself it was temporary, a reaction to extended exposure that would fade once I returned home. I filed my reports, submitted my analysis, and tried to return to normal life. But it didn't fade. It got worse. I found myself reading news reports about human colonies, following up on the refugees I had met during the war, researching human philosophy and ethics. His voice cracked slightly. I was caring about outcomes. Me, a supposedly neutral observer, lying awake at night worried about people I had no business caring about. Dr. Nash made a note on her pad. Have you discussed this with other members of your species? I tried. My fellow Vorthak listened to my war reports with professional interest. They praised my thoroughness and objectivity, but when I tried to explain what the humans had done to me, how they had changed something fundamental in my neural makeup, they could not understand. Krindal stopped pacing and looked directly at the human historian. They could not understand because it had not happened to them. They had not spent 3 years watching humans choose compassion over conquest, protection over victory, moral integrity over tactical advantage. So you kept it to yourself. For 20 years, yes, I convinced myself I could manage it, control it, keep it contained. I took assignments far from human space. I avoided news reports about human activities. I tried to be what I had always been, but I kept thinking about Haven Colony, about Colonel Brooks dying to protect families that included her enemies' children, about Captain Silva coordinating refugee relief for people whose governments had wanted to exterminate humanity, about Dr. Kim treating wounded hegemony soldiers with the same care she gave to humans. Krindle's hands were shaking more visibly now. I kept thinking about what Captain Silva told me, that humans do not make moral choices to win wars. They make them because they are right. And I realized something terrible. Dr. Nash leaned forward. What did you realize? That I wanted to be like them. The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would make them hurt less. I wanted to be the kind of being who would die to protect others. I wanted to care more about doing right than being neutral. I wanted to choose a side not because I was forced to, but because I believed in something strongly enough to take a stand. He collapsed into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. Do you understand what this means for me? My entire species, our entire identity is built on neutrality. We are observers, not participants. We record history, we do not make it. And I was sitting alone in my quarters night after night wishing I could be human. Dr. Nash set down her stylus completely. That's what haunts you. Not the memories of war, but the discovery that you were capable of choosing a side. More than that, the discovery that I had chosen a side. Without meaning to, without realizing it was happening, I had looked at the moral choices humans made and decided I admired them. I had watched the way they treated enemies and refugees and civilians and decided I wanted to be part of that. I had developed what humans call a conscience. Krindal's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. For 3 million years, Vorthak have been neutral observers of galactic events. We have recorded wars, famines, atrocities, and triumphs with equal detachment. We have been proud of our objectivity, our inability to be swayed by emotion or preference. And now I lie awake at night ashamed of my neutrality. I think about all the times my people documented suffering and did nothing to help, because helping would compromise our objectivity. I wonder how many beings died while we watched and recorded and congratulated ourselves on our professional distance. He looked up at her with eyes full of a pain she was beginning to understand. Humans taught me that neutrality in the face of injustice is just another form of taking the wrong side. They showed me that true strength is not in being unable to choose, but in having the power to destroy and choosing instead to protect. Dr. Nash was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she was hearing. What are you going to do? Krindle reached into his bag and pulled out a data pad. On the screen was an application for human citizenship, already filled out and ready for submission. I am going to stop being a neutral observer of human compassion and start being a participant in it. I am going to choose a side openly and permanently. I am going to become human, not in biology, but in the way I choose to live my life. Your own people will be horrified. I will be the first Vorthak in recorded history to abandon neutrality for chosen allegiance. They will consider me mentally ill, perhaps dangerous. I will lose my credentials, my professional standing, probably my welcome in Vorthak space. He touched the submit button on the application, but I will be able to sleep at night knowing that when good people needed someone to stand with them, I chose to be there instead of just watching and taking notes. Dr. Nash watched the application process on his screen. Any regrets? Krindal looked out the window again at the mixed community going about their daily lives in peace. My only regret is that it took me 20 years to find the courage to stop being neutral about the things that matter. The application processed successfully, somewhere in human bureaucratic systems. Crindall was now officially listed as seeking citizenship based on moral conviction rather than practical necessity. You know, Dr. Nash said softly, I think you've been human for a lot longer than you realized. You just needed time to admit it to yourself. Crindall smiled for the first time since the interview began. Perhaps, but that is what haunts me most of all. Not that humans changed me, but that they showed me who I had always wanted to be underneath all that forced neutrality. He stood up and extended his scaled hand to the human historian. Thank you, Dr. Nash, for letting me finally tell this story. All of it. Even the parts that make me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Outside the window, the mixed community continued their daily lives, unaware that they were living proof that choosing compassion over neutrality was not just possible, but necessary for anyone who wanted to help build a better galaxy.